To my dear community of the Seed Shul, I never imagined when I began 3.5 years ago as your rabbi that I would sit down on a Wednesday afternoon and write an email to tell you that we were closing the shul. Events have moved very rapidly since last week, and I for one didn't imagine that we'd all be spending this Shabbos completely by ourselves, with all of the shuls closed. Nevertheless, at least we have the familiarity of a Shabbos. It's the same Shabbos that we celebrated last week and the week before, and it will be the same Shabbos that, please God, we celebrate once all of this is finished, together again in good health. And this week's Parsha mainly deals with the Moleches HaMishkan, the work of the building of the sanctuary the Jewish people built in the desert. But at the very beginning, it tells us about the mitzvah of Shabbos. The Pasuk says, Sheishes Yomim Teosem Melacha, Uvayoyim HaShavi'i Yelochem Kodeh Shabbos Shabbos El Hashem. For 6 days you should do work, and on the 7th day should be a day of rest dedicated to Hashem. And the question is, what's this got to do with the building of the Mishkan? The Jewish people have already been told to keep Shabbos. We read the 10 Commandments a couple of weeks ago in the Torah, where we were commanded to keep Shabbos. So why is it that at this point the Jewish people have to be commanded once again to keep Shabbos? And the Gemara in Masechah Shabbos tells us that the Torah was telling the Jewish people that although building the Mishkan is important, maybe one of the most important things that they would ever do, nevertheless, there's one thing that overrided it, and that was the day of Shabbos. That when the 7th day of the week came, they had to cease from all of the work of the Mishkan. In fact, the Gemara tells us that this is the source from the fact that the Torah puts Shabbos next to the work of building the Mishkan. This is the source for the 39 categories of forbidden work that we're not allowed to do on Shabbos. All of those activities that were needed to build the Mishkan, those are the things that we're not allowed to do on Shabbos. Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch points out something very interesting. The word used in the Torah for these forbidden categories is maloha. And we often translate that as work, the 39 categories of work. But says Rav Hirsch, when we analyze these 39 categories, there's many of them that actually are very, very easy to do and don't seem to fit in with the word work, which usually means physical labor. For example, if you carry something very light from one domain to another, from one place to another where there's no Eruv, then a person has violated one of those categories. If a person selects and sorts something in a way that he's not supposed to, then he's violated one of those categories, even though neither of those things are very hard work at all. And on the other hand, there are many things that we can do which involve a lot of physical labor, but don't violate any of those categories of maloha. We could schlep heavy things around the house all day without violating any prohibition on Shabbos. Therefore, says Rav Hirsch, that in fact the true definition of maloha is not work or physical labor, but rather it's any act that shows man's mastery over God's creation. Sheishes Yomim Teosem Malocha. The Torah tells us for 6 days we should work. We take the world that we live in and we elevate it, we control. We show that we can do something to improve, as it were, God's creation. But on the 7th day of Shabbos, we take a step back. We relinquish our control. We don't do anything to change Hashem's creation, nothing that shows our mastery over Hashem's creation. And by doing so, we realize that in fact, it's Hashem who's in control, who's in charge of all of those 6 days that we were working as well. I heard a beautiful story this week from Rabbi Pesach Krohn, which I think really illustrates this point. In Mexico, there was a famous architect known as Jacobi, whose name was Jacobi Sharem. Jacobi used to build buildings, and once he'd designed and built these buildings, then he would sell them. And one time he built a very large, a huge office building in downtown Mexico City. And for some reason he couldn't find any buyers. Not only could he not find any buyers, he couldn't find anyone to rent the office space, and he was getting more and more worried, more and more desperate. What was he going to do with this huge building that he'd built? And he was contacted by 2 buyers who came from abroad and wanted to meet with him. And they met with him on a Friday afternoon, and they began negotiations to buy the building. The negotiations were intense. and they were going very, very well, when Jacobi looked at his watch and he saw that there was only 2 hours left until Shabbos began. Now Jacobi and his wife Sophia were not yet Shabbos observant, but nevertheless, Jacobi had recently been learning with Rabbi Deutsch in the Kollel in Mexico City, and he decided to close his business on Shabbos, and he'd started to attend shul on Shabbos morning and on Friday night. And he said to these 2 businessmen, look, I hope you'll understand, but in a couple of hours it's going to be Shabbos, my Sabbath, day of rest, and therefore I need to stop the negotiations in half an hour. We can carry on afterwards, after Shabbos ends. The 2 men looked at him and they said, we're in the middle. We still need to see the insurance details. We need to see the building plan. We can't stop now. We have to finish this. And Jacobi said to them, I'm really sorry, but I need to stop in half an hour. Otherwise the deal is off. The 2 men said to him, look, we're leaving tomorrow morning. Tonight is our last chance to get this deal done. Either now or never. With that, Jacobi said to them, I'm very sorry. He picked up his papers, he turned, he left the office and left the deal behind. That night, Jacobi was sitting in shul and he was thinking to himself, did I do the right thing? I left this huge deal. This would have made me so much money. And after all, there's a Shabbos every week. I could have gone to shul next week instead of this week. He sat down on Friday night with his wife, Sophia, and they discussed it together. And they decided that the reason why they kept Shabbos was to show that Hashem was in charge, that it was His world. And since Hashem was in charge of the world, then Hashem would surely reward them for doing the right thing. 2 weeks later, the date was Thursday, September 19th, 1985, and a huge, absolutely horrific earthquake struck Mexico. Over 4,500 people were killed, and all of the buildings in Mexico City were flattened. There was one huge office building that remained standing amid the rubble. That was the building that had just been built by Jacobi Sharem. The Mexican government soon contacted Jacobi and asked him if they could rent space. There were no other office buildings left in the city. Other firms came running soon as well because they all needed office space, and before he knew it, he'd managed to rent out his entire building. Jacobi and Sophia became very, very wealthy from this episode. And they decided that they would take upon themselves to keep Shabbos every single week from then on. They saw clearly how Hashem was in charge of the world, and that when they took a step back to keep His Shabbos, that Hashem looked after them. You know, we're going through times which are extremely difficult for all of us. I think one of the hardest things is that we feel panicked. We don't know what's going to be. We don't know what's going to be in the next day, sometimes in the next hours. We don't know what the new restrictions will be on us and on our families. And we're unclear about our livelihoods, about our health. Yesterday I phoned my rabbi, Rav Zimmerman, and I said to him, what does Hashem want from us in these difficult times? What are we supposed to be working on? And he said something very simple, which really resonated with me, because I think it's so true. And that is that nowadays, in these difficult times, we're supposed to realize that Hashem is in control. That all of those things that we normally do, that we think we're in control of, whether it's our health, our homes, our families, our businesses, all of those things, we have to realize that in truth we're not in control. We feel like we are, but really we're in Hashem's hands. If we can internalize that in these difficult times, then not only can we get through without panicking, but in fact we can feel secure. Because we may not understand what is happening or why it's happening, but one thing we can understand, that we're safe and secure in the hands, in the control of the Creator of the world. Just like on a Shabbos, we take a step back and we take a pause from all of the activities that we usually occupy ourselves with all week. So similarly now, we've been forced to take a pause from our lives. We've been forced to realize that we have to relinquish control and that we're in the hands of Hashem. Please God, all of us can use this as an opportunity for growth. Let's all try to stay healthy, to listen carefully to the government and the NHS guidelines, to keep calm, and above all, to feel secure in the hands of our Creator. Wishing you a peaceful and restful Shabbos.